What happened in 2012?
We got deplatformed by Apple. So Apple took away all of our apps. We probably had 180 apps or so. They never really told us why, right? They just said for violation of App Store rules. And just think about the power that these platforms have, right? They can decide on a whim to kill your business, the livelihood of 140 or so people. On top of that, millions of customers that were depending on your apps, whether it's for utility, enjoyment, entertainment, whatever that was. And of course, with zero accountability.
What is the optimism? How optimistic are you about the future?
What happened with FTX, that was obviously really bad and set our industry backwards. But it did bring the conversation forward, and it created frameworks where we can feel more secure, because people started saying, okay, this is interesting, we should learn about this, but how do we make sure that that type of stuff doesn't happen again?
Would you say then that most NFT businesses or Web3 brands that have NFTs as part of their business model have been building wrong?
Yes.
Yat, you're the chairman of Animoca. In 2018, your business was valued at 100 million.
Actually less.
Less than that.
So early 2018, our valuation was, I think, sub $10 million.
Sub 10 million?
Yes.
Which makes my stat even more dramatic. In 2023, that valuation was about 5 billion. From your perspective, from the inside, how is it managing and overseeing one of the largest entities in an entire industry?
So I don't think we ever set out thinking about sort of building the biggest entity, right? That wasn't really the vision. The vision was really around sort of digital property rights, which was the mission. When we saw what happened in Web3, we just saw not just the opportunity potential, but just something that we think could really change the world. And so we just went all in that. And I think this to me is really what happens when people find really purposeful, impactful businesses. The growth and scale happens just because you're in it, so to speak, not because you're necessarily planning to do this. But of course, as we discussed a little earlier, as the scale of the business grew, and as we took these sort of bets and sort of purposeful investments that we did, and they grew really large as well as our operating business, and coming to the kind of valuation that we are right now, we also have to be much more responsible about what we do, and we have to be more mindful about the impact that we have in the industry. And I would say the impact isn't our valuation, although that's obviously one way that people benchmark it. It's the fact that we've invested in over 540 companies, for instance, right? That's actually, I think, the more impactful part. And that we've also been helping grow the industry, and that we're trying to sort of, really focus on promoting the culture of Web3. And also we're trying to sort of get people to understand what is the actual meaning behind Web3. That's what you see us doing a lot right now, telling people, particularly, in 23, when the market was really poor, we're out there evangelizing the space, making sure that everyone knew that, hey, there is a space out there that's actually true and purposeful, and there's impact that's been happening as opposed to all the bullshit you've been reading before. But that's something that probably we couldn't do 3 or 4 years ago when we were a small company. But today, when we have this sort of scale and impact, we have a voice. And so we have to use that voice in a manner that I think is one that helps grow the industry forward, which is kind of what we're thinking about right now. So that means we're also more involved in policy. We're also more involved working with governments, for instance, all that type of stuff that before we didn't have to do.
Back then, what was the company's headcount back in 2018?
Well, we were sub 30 or 40 people.
Sub 30 and 40. How about today?
We're over 1,000 people.
Over 1,000?
Yeah, over 1,000.
That's
that doesn't
incredible.
include our portfolios. It's just basically a direct headcount.
There's Naval Ravikant, who has a quote that says, "There's no difference in how busy an entrepreneur gets. A local coffee shop owner works as hard as the Fortune 500 CEO. They're both putting in the 14 hours per day, 7 days a week. So might as well shoot high for the big goals."
Yes.
For you, how has your day-to-day changed from having that company with 30 people versus today, 1,000 people?
Well, I mean, it's changed drastically in the sense that I was much more involved in product and these sort of things earlier. I still am involved in a way, but not nearly as much as I was before, right? And I spend a lot more time basically talking about the industry, evangelizing the space, high-level strategy. I have an excellent management team that's basically helping me sort of navigate the space. And one of the reasons why I can travel the way that I do and talk about the industry is because I have a team back in Hong Kong that can help manage everything, which is something I couldn't do before, right? And I think Naval's quote is definitely succinct in the sense that I think everyone works hard, right?
Right.
I think especially those who obviously intend to or wish to succeed. And I think some of us are fortunate to be in a situation where we can have an impact in the world. But I would say every person who works hard has an impact of some sort, right? Even the small coffee shop actually has an impact to its local community. They're actually increasing their net productivity and their net happiness and all these things that are also meaningful. So it's not to say to diminish the effort of people who are working on other things. It's just to say that the impact that you have, and maybe the preparedness as well, right? Not everyone wants to do this. I mean, you see, for instance, many examples of founders who take a company up to a certain point, like for instance, before they go IPO. But then when they go IPO, they go, you know what? I don't want to run a company. I want to run a company like that.
Right.
And then someone else comes in and runs it. And it's not just sort of the caretaking or the adult in the room effect. It's just that that founder isn't happy and doesn't feel as productive in that particular environment and basically wants to keep building in his or her particular way. So I would say, again, each to their strength, as it were, right? And I think in Web3, we have this interesting combination where you're both sort of a builder, but actually the most successful Web3 leaders are also the ones who are quite comfortable being public. And also public in terms of a persona and sort of talking about what they're doing and being forward facing, which again is not something that all entrepreneurs are comfortable with.
And Yat, you say that obviously today you have a leadership team that helps spearhead the different departments as part of Animoca. A lot of the people that are listening to this would one day aspire to be in the shoes that you are today. What does the day-to-day of someone spearheading a company like yours look like? What are the types of decisions that you're making? Paint the picture of what a typical day in the life of Yat looks like.
Okay. Well, I mean, so first I would say, regardless of what you do, I don't think it doesn't matter if you're the CEO or the chairman of a large company or whether you're running a coffee shop. The most important thing, I think, is to be mindful of your personal health and well-being. And I don't mean that necessarily just in terms of it's sort of, taking care of yourself, just physically, but also spiritually, right? So basically making sure that you're happy in what you do and that you can start the day with the right kind of energy. So for me, that means, having exercise in the morning, for instance.
Right.
And basically sort of, I don't need as much sleep as some other people from what I gather. And I'm comfortable with that. But some people, for instance, need more sleep and they need their 8 hours or whatever, then they absolutely should do that. So there's certain rhythms and patterns that I think you as an individual may have that gives you the right energy to start the day. And then I generally have a way of operating where I prefer basically to normally, conference season aside, do the really difficult stuff in the sort of morning, not just because I'm fresher, but because, I have and more energy, but also because I feel like I'd like to end the day usually with things that are sort of happier, shall we say. Now, that's not always the case, but in other words, work with one of the toughest problems in the morning and the most uncomfortable stuff, and then try to end the day, in a way that you can sort of sleep well, shall we say, right? And by the way, when I'm in Hong Kong, to me, that's the equivalent of hanging with my family, for instance, or having dinner with them, for instance, which is a privilege today because of the way that I travel, or taking my dog for a walk, for instance, right? So those aren't necessarily work-related things, but they actually give you clarity for the performance that you have at work. In terms of decisions, I mean, as an organization, we do have a structure. We have something like an XCOM where we meet on a regular basis, discussing high-level sort of strategy things in terms of whether it's acquisitions or M&A. We do have an IC, which is an investment committee. Though that investment committee, I no longer attend as frequently as I used to, right? Before, I was in every one of the investment decisions. Now those investment decisions are a committee of, literally 15 to 20 people. And they make decisions about whether we should make an investment or what we should do in those areas, which allows me the freedom to not participate in all of that, but also basically allows me to think about some of the sort of bigger picture items. So for instance, sometimes I'll write about stuff, I'll think about macro issues in the market in terms of explaining how the space is pushed forward. Because at Animoca, we don't think of ourselves as just a company that's building a product or sort of, trying to gain customers for our services, for instance. The way we think about ourselves is pushing the entire Web3 industry forward. So when we share content, for instance, whether it's about NFTs or about sort of, tokens or about the market, for instance, it's for everyone, right? It's really to try and push the industry forward because we have sort of this voice, and also the way we've invested, we've created essentially a stake in the entire Web3 ground. In other words, we will win or lose based on whether Web3 succeeds or not, right? So in other words, therefore, we've set ourselves up in a way where the entire industry is essentially our business, as it were, in some form or fashion.
Right. Animoca started in 2014 as a gaming publisher, as a gaming studio.
Yeah, actually, we started in 2011. We started in 2011 as a game company, a mobile game company.
Okay.
But we spun out in 2014 to become public in Australia.
Okay.
And that's why I think, and sort of rebranded from Animoca to Animoca Brands. So I think that's why technically you're correct. Like the Animoca Brands you know today was birthed in 2014, but its roots really began in 2011 as the original Animoca were making mobile games on the App Store. And actually we were one of the most successful mobile gaming companies up until 2012. I would argue either top 5 or top 10 mobile game developer at that moment in time.
What happened in 2012?
We got deplatformed by Apple. So Apple took away all of our apps. We probably had 180 apps or so. And they never really told us why, right? They just said for violation of App Store rules. And that was really our, let's call it digital sort of, I guess, our digital equivalent of what it was like to essentially be in a centralized platform that would essentially take away everything that you had. And at that point, we had 140 or 150 employees making games. And we had investors, and you can imagine. So obviously we had to restructure, we had to do all sorts of stuff, right? But, there was no appeals process. There was no way, nobody could call at Apple and say, hey, you know what? Maybe there's a misunderstanding. Can we have a chat, right? Nobody tried to call us, right? And just think about the power that these platforms have, right? They can decide on a whim to kill your business, the livelihood of 140 or so people. On top of that, millions of customers that were depending on your apps, whether it's for utility, enjoyment, entertainment, whatever that was. And of course, with zero accountability, right? That's the thing, right? And that's one of the things where we started thinking about, wait a second, that's having power, but with no accountability. And you can do whatever you wanted. And that was sort of, we didn't really understand how blockchain could solve this until much later. But we always were thinking at that point about how can we become really more independent? How do we not depend on those platforms the way that they've made us? And so I think this is really, in many ways, a Web3 story.
That's incredible. So in overnight, you got your business stripped away from you.
Yes.
If you were to recall back to that specific evening, how were you feeling?
Oh, it was crazy. I mean, I was actually at the airport,
okay,
going to Japan because we were about to do a transaction that could have potentially led to the sale of our business at the time because we were really fast growing. And at the time, what we may not maybe fully appreciate is that in 2009, that's when Angry Birds launched, right? So, or was it 2010? Something like that, right? I think it was 2010. And in 2011, there were a whole flurry of mobile gaming companies emerging, and many of the large gaming institutions around the world were like, oh, we need to go into mobile games, right? And we need to grow in that space. And so, we were a small business at the time, relatively speaking, doing about $30-40 million of revenue, so not bad. So we were, I think, a pretty suitable, acquisition candidate. And that was some of the conversations we were having, potentially maybe just for investment, but that was kind of the range. And riding high, business doing well, let's go and meet those. And then right at the airport, cancel my flight when basically I got a call from the office and saying, all of our apps are gone. And I'm like, what? And so I obviously opened.
Incredible.
At the time, by the way, this is why I don't have an iPhone, right? I have an Android phone now. But at the time, I opened my iPhone and I was like, shit, where are all the apps, right? What's going on, right? And, we had no idea what was happening. So I actually tried to reach out through our investors, through some of our partners, and we were basically stonewalled, right? And the only thing we did get back was, don't deal with us. As in, the feedback was that, we're sort of some kind of quasi-criminal organization. We did something, really, really bad and whatever. But no actual, no presumption of sort of guilt until proven innocent. It was just this rumor. And on top of it, what I can also share is that for a couple years after, in the Valley, we were very much treated as a quasi-pariah as well. Because if you associated with us back then, then you might get into the bad books of Apple potentially, right? It was that kind of effect, right?
Interesting.
Like, and so people don't really understand really how insidious that effect is, right? And on top of it, that wasn't even a decision that was made maybe by someone who was very senior. Who knows, right? It was just someone who basically pushed a button and decided, that was it,
right?
Or maybe they just had fun, this sort of joke that people have in these cartoons around sort of, back in the days of ancient Greece when, Zeus and the gods, right, were just kind of playing around and having fun with the mere mortals. That's basically how it felt for us, right? With no responsibility,
Apple.
kind of like that, right? And by the way, this isn't just an Apple issue. We see this happening, at Facebook. We see this happening all over because, and again, I would argue that it's not to say that people have necessarily bad intentions, right? Because remember, in their view, they probably really thought we're doing something good in their mind, but there is no due process, right?
Correct.
So in other words, at least have a way to hear it out and understand it. That's the whole reason why we've set up a democratic principle, a justice system to ensure that, if there is a miscarriage, that there's at least a way to debate it and discuss it and bring it open. Here, there's no accountability. And so, of course, as a famous saying goes, absolute power corrupts absolutely. And that's exactly what happened.
It does. But also another saying is the road to hell is often paved in good intentions.
Yes. Yeah.
Everything, whether it's control, the overregulation, centralization, all of those oftentimes are in good intentions of protecting the user.
Oh, sure.
There must have definitely been a reasoning behind losing your business.
Even if you look at history, like things like, Marxism and communism,
Absolutely.
The intentions were good. The outcome was disastrous for humanity, right? So again, I would say, people I don't believe that people intend to go out and want to hurt people, but there are assumptions because they are human, right?
Mm-hmm.
And therefore, the whole reason why this sort of democratic principle works really well is that there's a checks and balance that you can actually work with others to say, hey, you know what, is this right? And is it an outside thing? For instance, boards of companies, public companies, have intentionally independent directors. Why do they have independent directors? So that you have an outside person that can review from a sort of unbiased lens, so to speak, a different perspective than just the ones that are running the company, because maybe they're blindsided, or maybe, there's an emotion attached, or, all these things that could possibly cloud your judgment, because we are human after all.
We are.
Right. Yes.
We are. And one can say that the event that happened to you in 2012 was, in truth, a blessing in disguise.
It was. I think it didn't feel like one at the time.
Right.
But I would say that all these lessons, and so to me, I don't have any, like regrets of the past, in the sense that everything that happened in the past actually shaped who you are today. And in fact, the tougher the lesson in many ways, actually, the more you actually learn something from it that you can take forward, right? So I think in that sense, if we didn't get deplatformed by Apple, or we didn't get sort of removed from a stock exchange, which is another story, right? We probably wouldn't be the Animoca that we are today.
Pressure makes diamonds.
Yes, that's a good one.
Moving forward 6 years after, that's really when Animoca had its big pivot into blockchain and into Web3. Between 2018 and today, 2024, the industry has changed quite substantially. And you've been part of it all
Probably
along.
10 times over, but yes.
You've been part of it, seen the change, been really in the trenches since day one. For you right now, the way you're seeing the industry evolve, what is the optimism? How optimistic are you about the future? Are we heading the way you're seeing it in the right direction for the future of our industry?
So first, I would say that you can never really predict the direction, broadly speaking, in the sense that the way you'd like it to develop, right? And that's only, and for instance, when we think about when we pushed into gaming, we actually didn't really expect that it would be DeFi summer back in sort of, basically 20 and 21, that would actually push really the Web3 gaming narrative, because actually DeFi summer created the rails and the financial engines to actually make Web3 games work, right? Up until then, we were very focused on NFTs, which is still very relevant, but around the ownership. But we were really thinking more in terms of Web 2.5. And that understanding, by the way, led us to understand and appreciate more that the financial network effects in a Web3 environment, game or otherwise, are actually very critical, which we underappreciated, I would say, in the first few years, right? In 2018, 2019, I don't think that most of the industry really understood just how sort of critical the financial aspect of Web3 games was in order to sort of make it grow the way that it is, right? As an example. And so I think we're still learning and sort of evolving. So I would say today, for instance, when you look at the rise of meme coins, again, we weren't anticipating that in this manner. I mean, this year alone, I think something like 2 or 3 million meme coins were launched, right, for instance, right? I mean, on one hand, that's an insane number. On the other hand, I would say some critics would say, oh, it's diluting the space and it's unfortunate. But I'm generally an optimist. Mm-hmm. And the way that I look at the space is that the evolution of meme coins is actually just another lesson for us to see how we can mature the business broadly, right? So for instance, right now, there's an interesting parallel to me about the introduction of meme coins, while at the same time, we've got the introduction of institutions with Bitcoin ETFs, right? So you have on one hand, sort of this absolute let's call it mass consumer, sort of degen culture, but also fun, maybe very speculative environment, mixed in with the introduction with the ETFs of very, very sort of well-established institutions coming into the space, creating a new dynamic that, for instance, we didn't really forecast 3 or 4 years ago, and then you have to navigate with the space. So I would say, but the main driver is mass adoption. So in other words, both of them contribute in a way to mass adoption in their particular ways and narratives. So that means that even when what happened with FTX, that was obviously really bad and set our industry backwards. But it did bring the conversation forward, mm-hmm. and it created frameworks where we can feel more secure because people started saying, okay, this is interesting, we should learn about this, but how do we make sure that that type of stuff doesn't happen again? And again, I would say that these sort of shakeups actually create more resilience into the market at the end of the day, right? And I guess, as I say, what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. And that's exactly basically where the industry is today. So I would say the industry is fundamentally much stronger than it was, say, even 2 years ago, right? 2 years ago felt maybe a little bit more frothy in comparison and more volatile, right? But when you look at, for instance, the Bitcoin dominance, when you look at, for instance, Ethereum, and the ones that have institutional backing, those type of token ecosystems, you'll see that generally it's been quite good, right? And then in the altcoin space, this is the other thing. People are looking at sort of altcoins and saying, oh, that market hasn't been doing very well. But actually, collectively, it's been doing incredibly well. We've grown by almost 70 to 80% over the last 12 months in the altcoin space. Okay. The only, the only difference is that it's diluted over 2 million tokens, right? Mm-hmm. So the attention is different. So, before maybe a person would have a collection of, 10 or 20 projects that he was tracking, and now suddenly he has hundreds of them in his portfolio.
Absolutely.
So again, the dynamic of the market has changed. But I would say broadly, the mind share of that attention of our space is better. And of course, we can't forget, for instance, one of the big breakthroughs this year is TON. Right? I mean, for us, we're big backers of TON. We got into them last year to basically sort of see if we can push mass adoption. And we're seeing this already today, where hundreds of millions of users are sort of, yes, they're playing whimsical, silly things, whether it's Hamster Combat or, Catizen or Gamey or what, or, all these type of things Absolutely. That they're sort of doing. But it brings them into the space, and they now have a Web3 wallet, and they're sort of learning about it. And then from there, they'll actually evolve into other areas of Web3 and start actually using the space. So, and that's actually what we projected. We predicted broad growth. We thought there'd be broad mass adoption. But did we know that it was going to be TON Telegram 3 years ago? No. We had no idea, right? But we did know because we believed that the market will grow. And the fundamental belief was based on the fact that Web3 is just better for us, yes. Right? As an ecosystem, right? It's more equitable. There's more ability to sort of, share in the value of the networks that you're building. Once you're in Web3, that's the other thing. Once you're in Web3, you kind of don't get out, right? You sort of see that and say, this is just a better environment. And what we also found, and this was also universally true, where when you're in Web3, the users who are in it start to reinvest in other Web3 ecosystems, not just because they believe in it, but also because it's communal as well. There's a network effect in terms of, hey, you're in this project, I'm in this project, and ownership of the tokens, whether they be NFTs or fungible tokens, made you a member of something bigger and gave you a sense of belonging as well. And I think these were effects that we saw right from the beginning. That didn't change, right? And so you have some macro truths that we can follow, and how the markets gyrate will have to be flexible and we have to be dynamic. But generally, we think we're going to hit billions of people in Web3.
Correct.
And therefore, we just have to make sure that we are sort of in all of the areas to help make it grow and participate.
One thing you talk about, which is the reason why we see that cult-like behavior that's happening within our industry.
Cult-like.
Around tokens, around NFTs, around projects.
Yes.
Is because tokens and NFTs create that identity layer and culture on the internet.
Yes.
In a world of infinite pixels, we all of a sudden have the ability to own a few. And that's what NFTs and tokens allow. And obviously with the Animoca Brands, you recently launched the Mocaverse NFTs. But where my brain really goes is product market fit and the business model of NFTs. Historically, in traditional finance, there's two types of things you can sell. You can sell subscription items, so recurring products, it's your Spotify registration, and then you have reoccurring orders. That's consumables, whether it's your favorite restaurant or the Coca-Cola can at your favorite grocery stores. But the problem I see with NFTs is it's a one-time purchase of a product that never expires. And the buyers oftentimes end up expecting a lifetime access to value. And what oftentimes ends up happening is a team launches an NFT and ends up with a liability called a community, who they now have to fulfill a lifetime of value and benefits to. How would you make sense of the NFT business model? How does one make this sustainable and effective?
So, that is the $1 trillion question, isn't it? But first of all, regardless of whether it's a fungible or non-fungible token, what I think is important to understand and how we think about it is that tokens are containers of network effects. So the important way to think of it is that when you own a token, whether you give it or sell it, you're giving a part of your network away. And so the benefit of the ownership for the end user, be it a game, be it a layer 1, layer 2, it doesn't really matter, is how do I benefit from ownership of the network effects of the game in and of itself? Okay. So this, I think, is a distinction that a lot of people struggled with because, for instance, in the gaming world with NFTs, people were thinking, I'll just keep selling you NFTs, but then they dilute the space, for instance, right? Or with Bored Apes, for instance, when they launched the first Bored Apes, it was great. And then they started having sort of, basically mutants, and then you had kennels and then you had other things. Again, if you're selling to the same community, they felt diluted and had expectations in this space. And so it felt like, where does the revenue stream come from? But actually, when you're buying a Bored Ape, what you're doing is you're being part of a membership of a network. And the collective value doesn't come from the organization giving you the benefit. It comes from whether the network itself gives you benefit because of the network effects inherent. So when you take that to a larger network that's more established, let's say something like Ethereum.
Sure.
If you are a member of the Ethereum network by owning a bunch of tokens, you don't need a central organization to give you value. It's not up to Vitalik or Consensus or whatever to say, hey, I'm giving you value, because there's an entire community that actually helps you grow and helps you participate in that space. So in other words, I'm part of the Ethereum network because I can avail myself to DeFi or to other networks or to make friends or to have connections. Basically, that's the way that we think that people should look at generally network infrastructure, which tokens represent. So that means that when you're selling an NFT, you're actually not having a relationship as that of a classic customer. And also, we wouldn't say it's necessarily that of an investor either. It's a mixture, which we classify as a customer owner. So in other words, you become an owner. You're a customer, but you're an owner, right? And with that, you benefit from the long-term effects of the network effect, which the organization that might have sold you those NFTs will help perpetuate. But at the end of the day, you're not buying the NFT because you only care about what the game company does. You're buying the NFT because you want to connect to everyone else who owns the NFT. And so this is where the network effects become relevant. So for instance, today, I think Bored Apes is an interesting example, because if you own a Bored Ape, what percentage are you owning a Bored Ape because of the utility Yuga provides? Or because you can show off to your friends that you have a Bored Ape?
It's the second.
Right? And how many other people who have Bored Apes, unrelated to Yuga, are actually providing you valuable services because of that? That's why I own it, right? And the key thing is, and I think this is, again, one of the really difficult things about when people talk about Web 2.5. So Web 2.5 for me is sort of this word where I sometimes puke a little when I hear it. Not because it's a bad term, I get it, I understand it, but to me the question is, which side of Web 2.5 are you on? Are you 2.3, right? Or are you 2.7, right? Meaning, are you actually still really aiming for decentralization? And are you actually trying to expand the network effect? Because to expand the network effect the way that I described for you means to give up control, right? You can't actually have,
Interesting.
You can't actually build a true network where network effects can proliferate when you have total control. When you have total control, your expectation is you run the project, right? I'm buying the NFT because you're giving me all that value,
you run it.
right? But if it's actually decentralized, not just in saying, but in spirit and in meaning and in action, then you realize that you're owning this NFT or this token because the entire network adds value. And I think we're so early in the space that many of the projects aren't yet evolved there. But you can kind of see which ones really do this versus the ones that don't. And we're more advanced in fungible tokens. So we can look at, for instance, layer 1, layer 2s and say, yes, I'm not buying Solana or I'm not buying Ton because of sort of, this guy or that guy. And I think to me, when Pavel, was unfortunately arrested, obviously the token had an impact, but it held pretty strong, right? And actually the launches of basically other ecosystem tokens on Ton continue to do well, proving essentially that the network effects and the decentralization of the Ton network actually gives it a type of resilience. And today, how many people, for instance, would want to be buying, the Ton token primarily because they think Pavel is going to do something great, or because they actually want to avail themselves to the network effects of Ton and Telegram. Right?
Absolutely.
Yeah. So I think this is the primary way to think about it, and then from that, business models can extend. Because, for instance, if you have membership in the token, you can still sell them stuff, right? If you have a Bored Ape, I can, we see this, for instance, with jewelry, for instance, right? Whether it's, I think it was, Gucci, for instance, had a collection, and Tiffany's, or Sandbox the same. Gucci had something as well, right? You can actually sell physical items to that community and sort of avail yourself to the network and say, hey, you know what? If you have this special kind of NFT, I'll give you access to buy this certain thing. The revenue stream that they make is entirely unrelated to whatever Yuga was, for instance, doing, or whatever Mochaverse might be doing, or whatever Sandbox might be doing, for instance, right? You just access that network. And so that's the way to look at it. And I think the challenging thing that people sometimes have is they look at NFTs like virtual items in a game and they just sell. And I think that to me is that they don't understand that when they're selling a token of any kind, they're actually giving away a part of the network. Right? So I think that's the distinction that we need to make.
That's an interesting paradigm shift, by the way, which is the real value of the NFT is the network effect that comes with it. Would you say then that most NFT businesses or Web3 brands that have NFTs as part of their business model have been building wrong?
Yes. And the reason why they've been building wrong is because they've been building in a very centralized fashion.
Yes.
But not centralized saying, there's nothing wrong to say, I want to kick it off, right? I want to be the seed, or I want to sort of build a foundation to build it up. There's nothing wrong with that. What is wrong, though, is that you're creating an environment where you're the only contributor of value.
Interesting.
Right? And what happens is often, and this is where the conflict is, right? When you grow an ecosystem a certain size and you're capturing a lot of the value, there's a natural tendency to say, oh, actually, maybe I can keep more of that value. And then suddenly this idea of decentralization becomes more centralized, right? And we kind of see this, for instance, in the origin of some earlier blockchains, like layer 1, layer 2s, who went out to basically say, we're going to, I would say, an example of that was what originally happened with NBA Top Shot and Flow, right? And we're both investors in NBA Top Shot and Flow, and we think there's a bright future ahead of them, because of the IP and NBA. But in the early days, when sort of Dapper Labs had much of the control of the NFT market with NBA Top Shot, and then with the Flow blockchain, instead of opening up as quickly as possible, they actually made it a little bit more closed, and they didn't move as quickly as possible to open up the networks, right? And the consequence, of course, is that Flow ended up losing more traction at the end of the day, because it kind of forced people to go into an ecosystem that they couldn't get out. And actually what happened was that the network effects that Flow would have weren't as natural and as fast as the ones that were open. Remember, 2018, 2019 was the narratives of the Ethereum killers, right? Everyone was like, we're going to build blockchain to kill Ethereum. Nobody says that today anymore, right? And that's because network effects in Web3 are shared. So actually, what would happen if Solana became $1,000, for instance, right? Is it only beneficial to Solana? No. The entire Web3 ecosystem is going to go up, right? If Bitcoin goes to $100,000, everyone basically cheers, right? This is, by the way, not true in Web2, right? If Facebook doubles in market size, Apple would be terrified.
Yes.
Google would be worried. And none of those guys would see any benefit just because one of those Web2 entities would grow. But in Web3, because it's permissionless, because liquidity can flow over. I mean, just look at all the L1, L2 narratives where TVL basically shifts around, basically like musical chairs, right? That's only possible because it's your asset and you have the right to move them wherever you want, and because it's permissionless. And so the network effects are completely shared in this way. And I think if you understand that, I think you can succeed in Web3, which is why we at Animoca Brands, we have this motto where we say about, we believe in sharing the network effect. Because in fact, in Web3, the more you share in the network effect, actually the more you gain overall, right? If Bitcoin was, hash rate was controlled by just one or two miners, its value would never be what it is today. If Ethereum was controlled by just a few parties, again, its value would never be where it is today. It's about essentially the network effects that come from community ownership. The more community ownership feels secure in their ownership, actually the more value is built, which, by the way, is also the reason why countries that are democratic have a premium to their asset value, and the countries that are not that democratic have a discount.
It's interesting. A lot of good points. Circling back to the point where you were making about the dynamic between the central entity, which is the emitter of the product, which is the NFT, and the community. It's a little bit like leadership, where at the early stages, for example, Animoca back in 2013, 14, you were probably still working on the day-to-day. You were working on the product. But as your responsibility grew, now you started becoming an empowerer. You started multiplying the people that work with you so they can produce better.
Yes.
And that perhaps could be a good analogy to Web3 communities, which is initially being part of the creation process of the value, but eventually becoming the source of support to the people that are within the network, whether it's the community members, the leaders.
Absolutely.
The people who are going to make the network more valuable.
Yes, correct. And that's also why, for instance, at Mochaverse, we thought about identity. Because to us, it was, how do I create more value in the networks that we're trying to build and for you? And so that's why we started focusing on identity and reputation. Because the industry needed a reputation layer that was missing. Because one of the problems we have today in the industry is a lot of airdrop farming, for instance, which is okay. Airdrop farming is fine because you're adding value to the network. But when 90% of your population are bots, then that's an issue. They're just purely there to extract. And because we're in a capitalist framework, you're going to get these challenges. So then we have to prove that you're human. And of course, protocols like Proof of Humanity, which is why we invested in, is part of that equation.
Yes.
But it's all part of a puzzle to try to make sure that we're now actually building on-chain reputation.
With the Mocha IDs.
Yeah, with the Mocha IDs. Because for instance, if I know that you're someone who has been playing many games and that you're a good user, then I will probably want to give you more benefits as a result because I want you as a customer. But that means the benefit of having built reputation belongs to you. Now in Web2, actually you can build a great reputation. You could have 10 million followers on Instagram, but how much of that reputation benefit really belongs to you? That's the difference, right? And what we expect, for instance, in Mocha ID is as Mocha ID grows, we have no control over actually how it's being used. In fact, that's great because what we want is that more people say, hey, I like these people who have Mocha IDs because they play games and they spend money. So I'm going to offer my own airdrop. I'm going to vampire attack that community and say, hey, you know what? come to my product because I'm going to give you benefit, because I can measure now, based on your reputation, whether you're a user I want. But that means for us, the network effect inherent, the value of having a Mocha ID becomes more desirable.
Here's a question on that. Who determines what constitutes a good behavior on chain?
Well, we are starting it off by basically creating sort of elements of, we try to track loyalty, we try to track essentially behavior, we try to track basically, whether they engage in the game. But at the end of the day, it's an open stack, which means that third parties can start coming in and adding their own elements of loyalty and own elements of reputation. And the difference, of course, is that they become transparent for others to see. Mm-hmm. Basically, I might not know your name, but I know what your reputation is, right? It's kind of almost like, I don't know who you are, but if you went to Harvard, then I think you're smart, right?
Yes.
As an example, right? I mean, that's an example of how we look at symbolic capital as a way of representing essentially sort of, a kind of reputation. And the ones who give them that reputation will be third parties going forward. And then I can choose later on whether I take that reputation or not. So the fact that you went to Harvard might be good for your first job. But actually, in real life, what happens is that your second and third job, the fact that you went to Harvard becomes secondary. What becomes more important is the fact of what you did in your job after you went to university, right? And so reputation flows along. And how do we have a way of accrediting that reputation? In Web2, we don't really, right? You have a letter of recommendation, which then an HR person has to call up and verify and say, Precisely. Did you do that? And then sometimes they don't answer you, or all that kind of stuff. Whereas if you actually put that on chain, you can actually have a way in which you can really scale that sort of reputation discovery. One of the things that I find fascinating right now is, right now, if I actually have a profile that actually says what I do and has provable provenance around it, then I think opportunities will come to you, as opposed to I'm only looking for a job or looking for opportunity when I'm looking for it, right? Whereas actually organizations should have an opportunity to actually come find you, for instance, right? Because I know who you are and I can prove that. And I think LinkedIn does a little bit of that, but the problem with LinkedIn is that all sorts of people write all sorts of stuff that never happened, right? Because again, it's not on chain. Here again, we can put that type of stuff on chain, and I think that becomes really valuable for the end user and for the growth of the industry.
Right. Yeah, a lot of fascinating things being brought up. I do have a lot of questions for you, but we'll save those for another day.
Of course.
What final takeaways do you have for a builder that is perhaps watching this? What is one message you'd like to share with them to help them on their journey?
Well, gosh, one message. I mean, I would say in general, our motto, for instance, is, to build with impact and purpose. And when you're a founder, if you're able to sort of build for something greater than your own, then you will actually be able to sort of, I would say, maybe sacrifice is maybe too harsh a word, but the thing is that you'll have sleepless nights, you'll sort of have things to worry about. There's going to be earthquakes in relative sense in whatever you're doing, big or small, right? And you have to navigate them, and you have to have the resilience to do that. But the resilience comes from the fact that you're building on something that is really meaningful to you, right? And if your only purpose, for instance, this is we find with, like certain entrepreneurs, if your only purpose is, let's say, money, for instance, then there's many ways to make money, right? And which then they just switch and move and leave, right? But actually, if you really believe in what you're building and you want to create that kind of purpose, then you'll power through, because whatever path you choose to get there, it will meander, it will change. It won't be like, if you asked us about how our business would look like or how Web3 would look like 5 or 6 years ago, it would have been a completely different picture. Like we could give you a broad idea of what we want, which is, we think digital property rights is important and that people should have ownership. But how we get there, we'll try 100 things, but the actual path to get there might be something completely different, right? But that's okay, because your mission is still around giving people digital property rights. And therefore, you sort of spend all the time and effort to get there. And I think the same is true for founders and entrepreneurs. As you're building your business, sort of, try to sort of articulate or identify really what your mission and purpose is, in a sort of more succinct manner. And I think then you'll have a way in which you can persevere through whatever. All the other things like fundraising and all kind of stuff. I mean, there's tons of advice out there, so I won't have to go into that. But I think that's one of the things that I found to be quite helpful for the founders who really created an impact.
Build with purpose.
Build with purpose, yes.
Yat, thank you. It was a pleasure.
Thank you for having me.